Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and in this episode, we are talking about wokeness. Now, this is something I've wanted to do for a long time, actually, but I kept delaying it, and I kept putting it off because, frankly, it's a little scary to talk about wokeness because nobody can even agree on what wokeness is, much less what you should do about it, or what it means, or whether it's good or bad. It is, to put it lightly, a very incendiary topic. I think just using the word woke at the beginning of the podcast has probably put several of you on alert. You know, what is this going to be about? And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. Number one, what is wokeness? Is wokeness even a coherent concept? Is being woke even a real thing? And if so, what is it? Number two, is wokeness good or bad? Is this movement such that it is a real thing happening in society? Is it having positive effects or negative effects? Or both at the same time? How would we describe that? Number three, is it the kind of thing where wokeness was good but it has gone too far? If that's the case, how do we distinguish the good instances from the bad instances? What are the principles we should be following when we think about these debates? There's debates about a lot of social issues happening right now in society. A lot of them fall under this umbrella of woke, and I want to talk about how we think about those issues, how they fit into liberalism as a political philosophy, and what the principles are that should drive our thinking when we have these kind of debates and when we cover these kinds of topics. So that is the topic of today's show. There's no guest today, it's just me. I wanted to do it solo because, again, this is, I believe, a hard topic to cover. It's hard because it deals with very, very personal issues. It deals with issues of personal identity, people's fundamental rights. It deals with how society is changing over time. It's really fundamental questions and really big questions. And, you know, it's hard, to be frank, because there's the potential for people to get really screamingly, furiously angry with you. Nobody ever gets angry at me when I do a nice wonky episode on tax policy or on the federal budget. That's easy. I can do those all day long, and I will get no hate mail from those. But, you know, people get very riled up about social justice topics. Social justice basically just being another word for wokeness. It was like the previous generation's way of saying that. And there's a lot of pitfalls you can fall into. If you do an episode on wokeness, frankly, you risk falling into the whole wokeness has run amok kind of podcast guy thing. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to be one of those guys. I also don't want to be one of the people who are kind of like reflexively defending like very silly things that are happening just because it's, you know, people on my side of the aisle supposedly doing it. So it's a hard thing to do, but I can't leave well enough alone. I've wanted to talk about this for a while, so here we are. So I think we'll kick things off with the discussion of just what is woke? What does it mean? Can we even define it well? Is it a meaningful term? What is interesting, I think, here is that woke has had many previous names, I think. In the 90s, people talked a lot about political correctness, PC culture. And, you know, the edgy comedians would say things like, I'm not politically correct, I'm not PC. And I think that was the big dominant name for a lot of the things that we're talking about. There's also social justice. This was popular, I think, in the 2010s as a way to describe a variety of movements. And it's kind of a precursor to woke as a term. There's a lot of people who describe wokeness in various ways. I've seen people describe wokeness as a new form of religion. It's like the progressive religion, you know, and people on the left and young people are not very religious these days. And the new religion is wokeness. It's got a lot of similarities if you kind of squint to Protestant evangelicalism. You know, I'm not going to dive deep into that argument, I don't think. But That's one way I've seen it described. It's just a new form of religion. I've seen it described many ways. I've seen it described as respect redistribution. This is a way of redistributing respect in society from groups that have previously had it, mostly, say, white straight men who are rich, to all sorts of different groups, people of color, people who are not straight, to women, to the marginalized communities of the world, so to speak. I've heard some people claim that wokeness is not a real thing. Wokeness is just something that conservatives made up so that they can have a big stick to hit liberals with. Liberals and progressives are just being attacked using this term woke. It's just an invention of the right. Now, ultimately, when I think about all these things, I don't think that last view is correct. I do think woke is pointing at a specific set of cultural changes. You know, our culture is changing. In many ways, I think it's changing in positive ways over time, especially if you take the long view over decades and decades. I think our social values are better right now than they were in the mid-1990s. And they're certainly better than they were in the mid-1960s. And this change over time, you can use a lot of names for it. You can use human rights, or you can use political correctness, or you can use social justice, or you can use woke. But it is a coherent set of concepts. You are talking about things like intersectionality, trans inclusion in society, anti-racism, feminism, all sorts of stuff. But these are related concepts, and they're almost always grouped together. And I think woke is a useful name to describe this set of ideas that are real. And I understand why some people don't like the idea of being stuck with the label woke, because sometimes maybe your political enemies will use it to hit you with the stick that says woke on it, and they can score some political points that way. But you have to have a name. This is a real movement. It has to have a name. If you don't want the term woke, then invent another name for it. But it's a real thing. It needs some sort of name. So for now, we're going to say woke. Sometimes I'll say social justice interchangeably there. But I do think it's a real movement that needs a name. So either social justice or woke, either one can be used. Now, has this movement, social justice, wokeness, has it been good or bad for society, or something in between? I think pretty unambiguously, the answer has to be that it's been good. Clearly overall good, net good. Racism and sexism and homophobia and most forms of bigotry are real. You know, we can talk about other things. We can talk about potentially very silly things that have happened in the name of wokeness or in the name of social justice. But the dominant impact on society has not been from the silly things. The dominant impact on society is that most forms of bigotry have gone down over time. And this is a very, very important point. It's such a basic point to have to make, but it's true. If you look at what racism was in the 1910s, as opposed to racism in the 1960s, to racism in the 1990s and racism in the 2020s, clearly the 2020s are the least racist time that we've had in America and probably in most places in the world. Maybe there are some places in the world that are backsliding into more racism, but I think in almost all places in the world, this is the least racist they've ever been, right? And certainly in America, I know we've had a steady decline in racism, and racism is not at zero yet, but it is getting better. And I think you can say similar things for sexism and homophobia. These are problems that are getting better over time, and they're getting better because activists are fighting and the culture is changing. And in that sense, the dominant effect of social justice and wokeness is very good. It is unambiguously, to me, a force for good in the world. This is a pretty basic point, and I am going to spend some time later on criticizing wokeness and criticizing some of the silly stuff, but I want to make it very, very clear at the beginning, very clear that the dominant impact is that we're less racist and less sexist and so on, and that is obviously a good thing. Now, as I mentioned, the last few years have seen some instances of social justice and wokeness that are perhaps misguided, if we want to use very soft language. Misguided, silly, counterproductive, or just plain dumb or wrong. That should not distract from the overwhelming good that social justice has done overall, but it is real. We can't pretend like that kind of stuff doesn't exist. And if you pretend it doesn't exist, you're just going to be denying reality in some sense. One of the issues that I think we have, and perhaps we'll get into this later, is that I think society often, and people often, have a problem recognizing that ideologies and ideas and concepts can provide insight without being 100% true, without being 100% forever and permanently the dominant factor in everything. There are things like, different parts of feminist theory, standpoint theory, structural racism, etc. These ideas are useful, and they're like a tool in your toolbox. You can use the tool of structural racism as an idea to understand the world a little bit better. And structural racism, in some instances, is real. Now, does structural racism drive literally everything that's happening in the world? No, of course not. Can you apply structural racism in places where it doesn't actually seem to fit and it's a little bit silly to talk about it? Of course. And that does happen. And I think that's part of the problem, is that sometimes people fall in love with an idea in the social justice category, like perhaps structural racism, and they just apply it to everything. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Now, if wokeness is overall pretty good, and doing good things in the world for most of our history, but it's recently had some very silly things pop up, what does that say about the people who are kind of marketing themselves as the anti-wokes? Honestly, the anti-wokes are frequently some of the worst people in politics. There are some thoughtful commentators who question wokeness, who question what they would call woke overreach, or, woke politics being counterproductive. That exists. There are people who do this in a thoughtful, humane way. But I think there are a lot of others who frankly have a lot of power, who just want to discriminate and who want to hurt people and who are bigoted. And I think that's honestly the more common kind of anti-woke politics. People like Tucker Carlson, Ron DeSantis, Christopher Rufo. These are often people who want to take instances of silly woke overreach and use it as an excuse to take away people's actual human rights on a much more basic level. And we'll get into that. But overall, I've kind of established in my thinking, and I hope that you think this way as well, that there are many times when woke things are good and useful and necessary and productive and helpful to the world. And there are times when woke things are unhelpful and silly and counterproductive or just plain wrong. And I think one of the things that would be useful is if we had a set of principles to fall back on when the next controversy erupts, because there will be another controversy that you haven't even thought of yet. I have no idea what it will be about, but it might be about some brand new thing that you've never thought of before, and you're going to have to figure out what side of it you fall on. And it would be good to have guiding principles that you follow to figure out, in this debate that is happening about this social justice topic, what should we do? What principles should I follow? What rules of thumb should I use for what's useful and what's not? So I've tried to distill the way I think about this, and I'm going to share it with you. How I think about this, what the basic principles I fall back on are. The very first one, and the one I think I should mention before I talk about anything else, probably the most important one, is to treat people with dignity and with respect. This doesn't mean you have to agree with everyone at all times, but, having "don't be a jerk" as a minimum standard is something we should all be able to meet. Just don't be a jerk. Don't ever be a jerk to anybody. Just try to be decent and try to be kind. And, one of the things my grandfather told me, my grandfather who's been passed away for, well over a decade now, one of the life lessons I took from him when I was just a teenager, something he said to me that has always stuck with me, is just 2 words: be charitable. He would say this infrequently, but enough that it kind of got imprinted onto my brain. And he didn't mean charity as in the sense of donate your money to some organization. He meant to other people, just personally, just be charitable. Take a charitable interpretation of what they're trying to say. Take a second to understand them, to try to get where they're coming from. Don't be unkind. Be charitable. And I try to live by that as much as I can. And God knows I fail a lot. There's no perfection here. But this is something that I really do try to follow as best I can, knowing that I'm not very good at it. One of my favorite quotes, actually, is from Kurt Vonnegut. It's part of a speech that one of Vonnegut's characters is giving to a pair of infant babies. And the person says, "Hello, babies. Welcome to Earth. It's hot in the summer and cold in the winter. It's round and wet and crowded. And on the outside, babies, you've got about 100 years here. There's only one rule of that I know. God damn it, you've got to be kind." And that's always stuck with me. And so I think this is a really good principle to stick by. This especially applies if the people involved in these conversations are discriminated against or disadvantaged, or if they're feeling threatened. You should especially try to be kind and decent and charitable. This is my guiding principle in so many things, especially in, say, the pronoun wars about, should we call, people who identify, trans people who were born biologically as, say, men and now identify as women, should we use the pronouns they want? I'm just trying to be decent. I'm trying to be a charitable, kind, decent person. And it doesn't cost me anything to use the pronouns that they prefer. And so why would I not? It's just basic human decency to me. And so this is just something that, I think in all of the other stuff, we should always keep as a guiding principle: be kind, treat people with dignity and respect. Another principle that I try to stand by is preventing harm. I think when there is real harm being done in the world, we should try to prevent it. But at the same time, we have to recognize that not everything is harm. And this leads into a discussion of what is harm, I guess. One of the things that I think about is, the more concrete and realistic and grounded in reality the harm is, the more we should care about it, the more we should do to fight it. The vaguer the harm is, the more suspicious you should be, I think. For instance, let me give you a couple categories of things. If there was a law that, say, explicitly discriminated against people of a certain race, that would be something we should care about intensely and immediately and all the time until it's fixed. That would be like an overwhelming, overriding concern. It makes it legal, for instance, to discriminate based on race in your job and your hiring, or to, deny government services to people of a certain race. That's like the worst kind of racial discrimination, right? By contrast, if there is a law that is race neutral in how it's written, but is likely to be implemented in a way that is going to affect people of one race more than another, that's something we should care about, but it's also up down the sliding scale of the more obvious immediate racism. It's something we're going to have to think about carefully, how to mitigate the harms, what the original law is trying to do. And maybe the original law doesn't have as much of a racist intent, but it's racist in practice or something like that. But it's a more complicated scenario. Even further down the pole, you could say maybe there's some sort of language that is viewed to be insensitive, but not outright racist, and people are getting in trouble for using it. Here, the harm seems particularly more vague. Maybe the harm is real, maybe it's not, but it's certainly not as real as when the government directly discriminates against someone on the basis of race. depending on the particular language, maybe the language is fine and we should just get over it. Maybe the language is hurtful, but, there's a sliding scale to these things. I think it makes sense in these discussions of harm, when we're trying to avoid harm, to try to make the issue as concrete as possible. All too often, people fall back on, this is harming such and such thing without really explaining why. If someone is causing harm, or if some policy causes harm, we really need to be very specific about the ways that happens. And the less specific you are, the less seriously people are going to take it. So I think being specific and factual about what's happening is important. And this kind of leads into a second idea, which is that proportionality matters. Massive injustices deserve very strong reactions. Minor injustices deserve less of a reaction. This seems like an obvious point, but I worry that our public discourse is getting this less and less. It seems like often there's only two options. You're either fully on board or you are kind of cast out into the darkness. This is obviously a bit of an exaggeration, but I worry that we're moving in that direction. I worry that we are losing that sense of proportionality. There's a stat I saw recently that said 24% of professors worry that they could be fired for expressing the wrong views, and this mostly seems to be coming as part of the rise of social justice, and that number is going up over time, and that worries me as somebody who cares about free speech and who cares about academic freedom, who thinks those are valuable concepts. I don't want professors to be worried that they're going to be fired because they said the wrong thing. And to address the cancellation subject, obviously cancellation is a real thing, and cancel culture does exist. We've done a whole episode on this before, but ultimately sometimes it's good to cancel people. Truly evil people, think like Bill Cosby or Harvey Weinstein. Obviously we should cancel Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein, who are serial rapists and sex offenders. Sometimes it's like horrifyingly overdone. Think like the girl in the cheapao dress. This is a white girl, like 17 years old, who went to her prom in a Chinese-inspired cheapao dress, and it caused massive backlash, and this poor girl's life was probably ruined for several weeks due to, like, tens of thousands of internet strangers pouring their hate at her. That's horrifyingly overdone and deeply silly, and by the way, apparently actual Chinese people in China just thought it was cool that Americans wanted to wear their dresses to prom. But so there are instances where cancellation is obviously good, and there are instances where it's obviously stupid, but it does exist. And one thing that I want us to have more of, as kind of a third principle, I guess, is proportionality. I think proportionality is a valid principle that we should be looking at. For things that are deeply awful, horrible injustices, we should have very strong responses. Bill Cosby deserves to be fully canceled forever and go to jail for the rest of his life for all the sexual assaults he did. Other people do not deserve that strong of a response. There are other people who have done minor transgressions who should get whatever the equivalent of a slap on the wrist is here. I think proportionality is something I would like to see us just keep in mind. And it's hard because social media dynamics make it such that people want to go hard 100% reaction all the time. That's the way you go viral, is by claiming really, really extreme reactions. Noah Smith wrote a good piece on this. I think he said something like, we don't have cancel culture, we have cancel technology. I think his main point is that the culture has always been trending towards cancellation. People have always liked to cancel each other and to, socially to excommunicate people from their groups. This has always been a thing, but technology is what has made it a massive problem these days. That the scale of that attack, that social stigmatism, can now be orders of magnitude worse than what it used to be. So we've talked about a couple of core principles here. We've talked about treating people with dignity and respect as a core principle, preventing harm as a core principle, while recognizing that not all harms are equal. We've talked about proportionality as a core principle, that we should, react in proportion with what's happening. A fourth principle that I would lay out is that concrete outcomes are more important than symbolic outcomes. If you are talking about something that is going to affect people's material well-being, that is going to end up with either food on the table for them or food not on the table, that they're going to have legal rights stripped away or they're going to have legal rights protected, those things are very important. If you're talking about fixing things that are language issues or symbolic issues or kind of these weird, discursive academic topics that, nobody outside of a philosophy department or a weird corner of Twitter, nobody except those guys ever even talks about this stuff, that's less important. I'm not going to say that, the weird discursive language stuff is never important, and maybe it's a little important sometimes, but I just believe that concrete outcomes that affect people's real lived experiences, their real, meat and potatoes policy stuff, has to be prioritized over the symbolic stuff. Symbols can be important, but, if you asked me, Jeremiah, would you rather, for instance, tear down all the statues of Confederate generals that are all over the country, or would you rather shrink the black-white income gap? Well, I would rather shrink the black-white income gap because that's a real thing that really impacts how a disadvantaged group lives. The Confederate generals thing, maybe we should also do that, but it's just not as important. It just can't be as important as the questions of fact. Again, it doesn't mean we never deal with it. It just means, there's a prioritization that should be happening. Another principle that I try to keep in mind is that questions of fact are important. Your principles can tell you a lot, but your principles can't tell you the correct answer to a question of fact. Your principles should tell you to treat people with respect and dignity, to try to prevent harm, to act with proportionality. But there's a lot of instances where we just have to actually pay attention to the facts. What does research say about this issue? We really need to be careful to know the facts before we act. There's a couple of examples I can use from this that come from criminal justice policy. Defund the police is something that became hot a few years ago. I think defund the police is bad, not because it's woke, not because it's, social justice, it's wokeness run amok. I think defund the police is bad as a question of fact. Factually, it leads to worse outcomes for everyone, including black people. There's people who want to do defund the police and who promote it as a form of racial justice. But I just think factually, the specific concrete outcome of defund the police is that black people's lives will be worse. And it's important to know the research on that subject and to get that question of fact correct. It's not enough to just loudly advocate for some policy or a group of people who are disadvantaged. Just because there's a policy that says it is advocating for these disadvantaged people, that doesn't mean we should automatically support it. We should be careful to make sure that the policy is the right one and that we are getting the facts right. Another example comes from criminal justice research again, and it's something called ban the box. This is something where advocates of social justice realized that, black people are much more likely to be in prison, especially black men, and a lot of job applications ask, have you ever been to prison? Have you ever been in jail? And so they thought, well, we should ban that question. This is a little box that was checked off, so they called it ban the box. We should stop people from asking on job applications if anyone has ever been to prison. This will help the prison population, predominantly black men, get back into jobs more easily. And so they lobbied for this policy, and in many places they passed it. But what actually ended up happening was that, well, without being able to ask if people had ever been to prison, employers just started to assume that the black applicants were probably more likely to have been in jail. They were more likely to be criminals. They couldn't ask directly, so they just assumed it. And the factual outcome was that fewer black applicants were hired after the change. The change was actually negative for black job seekers after Ban the Box. They were less likely to get a job. And so, again, it's important to get the actual question right, not just to advocate for something that feels good. Questions of fact are important here. And we can't just surrender that principle because the people who are arguing for a specific thing, or they're on our side, they're on our team. We always have to keep that in mind, that questions of fact are important. The final thing that I want to say as a general principle is that when we're having these discussions, disagreement can be okay. Society is changing. There's a lot of things happening all at once with very highly charged topics about gender and race and sex and all sorts of stuff, man. And look, people are going to sometimes disagree. Society changes and not everybody changes all in the same way, all at the same time. Disagreement can be okay. Disagreement is not always harm. And we should just, again, keep a sense of proportionality and respect and dignity in these conversations. The only way societies ever make progress is by asking questions. I know that the whole, just asking questions, it has become a meme that people are like, don't just ask questions. But the only way we ever change is by asking those questions and eventually figuring out the answers. And maybe some people are going to get the answers wrong for a while. Maybe some people are going to ask the wrong questions for a while. But disagreeing with people and debating it out is how we eventually reach a new consensus. We don't really reach the consensus by just proclaiming a new idea exists and then, well, you have to agree or else I will permanently ban you from anything forever because you will be permanently tarred as a bigot. You just have to immediately 100% agree with me. That's just not how it works. And again, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but there are some people who have an attitude that's pretty similar to that. The process of debating and letting people figure these things out is important. We need to be good at identifying good faith disagreement versus bigoted disagreement. Disagreements based on core values versus disagreements based on questions of fact. You can't really change someone's core values except very, very slowly, but you can change their opinions about a question of fact. It takes some hard work. You're going to have the same conversation many times, perhaps, but that process is important. So remember that disagreement is not always harm. Disagreement is not always bigotry. And that process, it works. It's frustrating as hell sometimes, but it does work over time. The final concept that I want to talk about, the final principle, I guess, that we're going to mention here is the idea of failing with grace. Basically, I want you to consider the question, what if you're wrong? If you end up having been wrong on a particular issue, would you like the way that you behaved earlier? And this is tricky because, very few people are going to be on the right side of history on every single issue, on every single time they give an opinion, right? Very few people have a 100% batting average, so you really need to consider the idea that, number one, your views are going to change over time. What you believe right now is not going to necessarily be the same thing you believe 20 years from now. You are not going to necessarily be seen in retrospect, 100 years from now when history is judging you. Will they agree with you on everything? Maybe not. But if you failed, did you fail with grace or did you fail with some sort of bigotry? Were you a jerk? Were you a bigot along the way? One good example of this that I've seen is someone who commented that, it used to be the case that they didn't really take transgender people seriously. They didn't really believe in it as a concept or whatever. And to them, it was just kind of a silly made-up thing. But they were kind of committed to treating people with respect. And so they treated people like human beings. They used their pronouns if they wanted them to because it didn't affect them in any way. And in that sense, they failed with grace. They weren't jerks to anyone. They didn't try to take away anyone's rights. They mostly treated people with respect. And later, when they realized that, had the revelation that transgender people are valid, and this is a real thing, and we should respect their identities, they were wrong in a way that allowed them to fail with grace. And I think this is just a concept we should think about more seriously. If you were wrong about some question, are you going to look back and be embarrassed and humiliated by the way you acted? Try to kind of compose yourself and try to treat people in a way that even if you were wrong, you could look back with some sort of pride at how you acted in the situation. So, with all of those principles in mind, how do we treat the current situation with wokeness? The way I see the scene right now, keeping all those principles in mind, is that much of woke politics right now is still quite good, but that there is this undercurrent of silly and ridiculous and wrong stuff that is happening. I think the level of the silly and ridiculous stuff is still low, but the over-the-top silly stuff is growing, and that worries me. And I think we should do what we can to keep focused on the most impactful, most important, real issues. Now, sometimes progressives have this instinct to kind of circle the wagons and not want to permit any criticism. And look, I get the instinct here, especially in certain cases like transgender politics, where trans people are often just punching bags for conservatives. I understand why there's the instinct to just reflexively lash out at all and any criticism. But the thing is, this leads to embarrassing incidents that ultimately are going to hurt the overall goal of building a world with more dignity and equal treatment for all. And look, the silly stuff is happening, whether you want to admit it or not. There are things that are just crazy out there. People are getting mad at the Chi Pao girl when it's probably perfectly fine that she wore a Chinese-inspired dress to prom. You have people who use very weird academic language rather than plain language. They say people experiencing unhoused situations rather than homeless people. They say birthing bodies rather than women. They, try to ban the concept of field work because field work is something that slaves did when they're talking about field work in like a sociology department. You have people who say Latinx when no Latino person really uses Latinx. You have people who say being punctual is white supremacy. You have people who will accuse anything under the sun of being ableist, expecting authors to read or tipping or frosted mini-wheats somehow are ableist. You have just the silliest cultural fights happening on social media. You have, people getting mad because they removed the word fat from Roald Dahl's works. Like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Augustus Gloop is no longer described as fat. He's described as enormous. And again, this is all just very silly stuff. None of this, in a sense, really matters. And it just gives conservatives ammo, basically. Social conservatives will often use this very silly stuff to try to prevent useful stuff from happening, or to roll back progress. You have real fights that we could be talking about where in Alaska, some judge somewhere said it was legal to discriminate against LGBT people in many situations. You have Tennessee trying to undermine Obergefell and make it so that gay marriage doesn't really exist. You have the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. Florida's doing all kinds of ridiculous things, taking custody of transgender children away from their parents, banning gender studies, banning teachers from mentioning the concept of homosexuality at all. There's all of these things that I think are actual, real, huge issues, and we're spending all our cultural time on these silly fights, and the silly fights give conservatives ammo. It gives them some sort of stick to hit the progressives with, and then an excuse to do the actual bigoted stuff. Progressives often try to pretend this silly stuff doesn't exist, that it's not growing, and it has no power. But, it is popping up in more places, and we need to acknowledge that and do what we can to focus on the important stuff. So if you are a person with liberal social values, what do you actually want? And how do we get there? Well, that's a big question, but I can tell you what I want. I want people to be treated equally and fairly and with dignity and respect, regardless of their status, of their race, of their age, of their gender, of their orientation, any of that. Everyone should be treated fairly and with dignity and respect, and we should give people as much of equal opportunity as we can. I also want people to be able to respectfully talk about these topics without chilling effects. I view public dialogue and respectful disagreement as core liberal values. One of the things I worry about is that free speech might become coded as right-wing politics, and I refuse to let that happen. I refuse to let free speech become a code word for being right-wing. I don't think the right-wing conservative social warriors value free speech at all. Not in the slightest. And I will be sickened if they get to hypocritically claim it. You know, Ron DeSantis does not care about free speech. Not even a little. He's literally got a bill banning the discussion of certain topics in schools because they are too controversial, because they are against his moral code or whatever. Ron DeSantis is not a free speech warrior. He is an anti-woke, conservative social warrior. And so I want liberals to keep free speech as a value, and that means we have to be open to these kinds of conversations. I also think that we need more forgiveness. If someone is wrong but well-meaning, we shouldn't be calling them reactionaries or murderers or whatever. You know, we should allow them to fail with grace. We should keep proportionality in mind. I ultimately want to keep making progress. I want for the amount of bigotry in the world to keep going down. I think it has been going down decade after decade, and I want us to continue that progress. Now, how we get there is complicated. Sometimes the best political action is to go aggressively after a certain issue. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you have to wait, and that sucks, but sometimes the best strategic play to actually change the world for the better is to work in silence, is to work in the background. Again, we have to be willing to be flexible on these things, because making concrete, real-world change happen is the point. With all that said, hopefully this has been useful to some of you out there. I don't think this is going away anytime soon. We're going to keep fighting about wokeness. We're going to keep fighting about what it means. We're going to keep fighting about specific issues like transgender rights, like racism and anti-racism, like gender issues. All of this will continue to be present in politics for a very long time, probably for the rest of our lives and forever. This is probably a process that never completely ends. And even if some topic does kind of fade away, it'll just give rise to a new topic that gets lumped in with wokeness. And that's okay. That's the process of us advancing as a society. I hope the principles that I mentioned can be of some help for you when you are talking about these issues, when you're thinking about these issues, as the current issues are being discussed and as the next thing becomes a big woke topic. Maybe it's helpful. It's been helpful for me to kind of write all this out and to speak to this episode. It's helped clarify a lot of my thoughts, and hopefully it's helpful to you as well. I think that's probably where we're going to end the episode, but if you feel one way or the other, please let me know. You know, this is obviously a very charged topic, and anyone can always write in, and we always welcome comments here. mailbag@neoliberalproject.org is our mailbag address. You're free to write in telling me what a genius I am or telling me what an idiot I am. All sorts of hate mail. I'm hoping we did this episode in a way that does not get too much hate mail, but I would almost be a little disappointed if it got none. So, again, thanks for listening. Feel free to send in your thoughts, and we'll catch you in the next episode.